Okay, I'm ready.
Great. So, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Well, I've been engaged in public policy and particularly foreign policy for several decades, all the way back to the Reagan administration. At a college with the Heritage Foundation as a foreign policy analyst there. I had a predominant focus on a lot of the developing world issues, Africa, South Asia, Latin America. I also was champion there of the Reagan Doctrine, which was our policy at that time to assist those who were resisting Soviet and communist client states, and to assist those individuals who were picking up arms against tyrannical regimes at that time. This wasn't strictly an issue of assisting those on the right sort of ideological side of these battles, but it also was part of Reagan's overall strategy toward winning the Cold War. Historians, when they've looked back on it, there's been an obvious recognition of the role that our nuclear deterrent played, and the fact that the Soviets simply didn't feel they could keep up with that, or that it was leading anywhere. But a lot of this Reagan doctrine initiative of raising the costs of the Soviets' engagement globally really was a predominant factor in bringing the Soviet Union to collapse, the Berlin Wall to fall, and to see considerable liberation of many of these countries. Not all of them, but many of them. And I went on. I worked with the governor. I worked with the senator. I worked as a White House speechwriter to President George H.W. Bush at the end of the Cold War. And there's a lot of praise for the role that Reagan played in bringing the Cold War to an end. But and he did kind of the hard lifting, I think you would say, as part of that process. But it was really George H.W. Bush who navigated a lot of the intricacies and ensured that the end of that monstrous modern 20th century conflict was a peaceful one. And that was an enormous contribution. And I went on from there to work in the International Republican Institute, supporting as a director, running programs around the world, including in Asia, including in China, designed to develop kind of civil society and democratic institutions at a time when many of these were many of the countries of the world were kind of in nascent, democracies beginning to arise in promising ways. But, we felt the US support was necessary. So this was done with the backing of the US government, through our State Department, through the Agency of International Development. And in 2009, I have a private sector career of about 15 years of executive and management level healthcare experience, with exposure to China there too. It's very difficult to do anything these days without China's involvement, apparently.
Right?
But
I agree.
I had in 2009, I was one of the co-founders of the US Tea Party movement, hugely historic political movement in our country that really blocked Obama's presidency for 6 of the 8 years. We won the House in 2010 with over 60 self-identified Tea Party House members elected, came back and won the Senate in 2014, which blocked a lot of his judicial appointees, and really most underappreciated sort of was laid the groundwork, I would say, for a populist presidential campaign along the lines of that Trump offered in 2016, the rally-based approach, which we also had employed. And along the way, I've been all over the world. Been extensively in the Asia region, Taiwan, South Korea, Cambodia, went out with the Sihanouk forces during their battle against the communist regime there, and
Wow.
have been over the last few years one of the earlier spokespersons on the human rights conditions confronting the Uyghurs in East Turkestan, and that this was a crisis of immense proportions. And it's somewhat shocking to me, really, that it's taken a few years to kind of awaken both the American people and our government to the realities of what we face. And then, of course, I've done a lot of writing, books, book chapters, publications, Wall Street Journal, Christian Science Monitor, National Review on foreign policy and public policy and political themes.
That was actually going to be my next question, was how, since you stated earlier, you were the first, one of the first people to start addressing and speaking of the Uyghur issue. How did you get into that? What led you to speak about that?
Well, I've been engaged in following what I've seen as an emerging threat from China's Communist Party since the 1980s. I very early on back then had raised some concerns about the direction of our policy. As you likely know, the position of kind of the Henry Kissinger crowd, the Winston Lord crowd, our earliest ambassadors, was always one that China's growth economically and our closeness to China in the way of these exchanges and whatnot, all the way back to the Nixon administration, was a constructive development that was going to lead China to be more integrated into the rest of the world, less designed toward human rights abuses, more inclined toward working collaboratively and cooperatively with the United States. And of course, I've pointed out this has really been one of the most significant misrepresentations, lies really, that's been ever presented by the so-called expert class. These were sinologists. There was almost uniform thinking at that time regarding this, and it's really driven American policy, every aspect of our policy toward China, our trade policy, our exchange policy, our military and national security component, which has ignored a lot of their aggressiveness, and the human rights issues, where I think you can say that Tibet got a lot of attention, but not really much in the way of punitive steps from the United States. Hong Kong now also getting a lot of attention because you have the CCP violating a 50-year agreement, clear-cut violation, I mean, which has been a common theme really since the Mao's revolution, of their inability and unwillingness to keep their word on fundamental agreements. And now we have an official genocidal designation of what the China's Communist Party has done and is doing currently with the Uyghurs. I think we put a lot of pressure, a lot of communication into getting that designation done. I wish it had been done even a little earlier. It's always complicated, kind of working in a wide variety of challenges and topics. And there was some aspiration early on in the administration that we might be able to get some of these things done diplomatically without the punitive steps that we've now taken. But now that we've labeled them genocidal, it's important to emphasize that that's a very rare designation. I mean, you kind of put, in that category, Pol Pot, the likes of some of the great tyrants of modern times. And there has to be concrete ramifications, significant ones, that are designed to bring this to an end, or it's really simply a symbolic designation that's going to lose a lot of the potency and effect that it should have on our policy.
Yes, I completely agree. So you stated that, you're working actively on raising more awareness through your human rights and what you do. Do you see any, do you see any improvement in or any recognition in what you're doing? Or how do we end this? How do we make sure that we get the United States to recognize this
Well,
and more and actually take some action? Because there's, yes, you recognize it as a genocide, but then what are you going to do to, help the
right.
situation?
Well, I start with the fact that um, while China's been immensely successful, and when I say China, I don't mean the people of China, I mean the Communist Party of China. It's been immensely successful in
Yes.
navigating a lot of these multinational institutions like the UN. The designation of genocide is a significant one. And there is an obligation that the government has to permit UN inspectors and others. So I think the pressure has to rise most immediately. I think you have to look at this as like a series of developments because we're not getting, as you well know, the acknowledgement out of Beijing that they're engaged in this sort of behavior, just the opposite.
No,
They're
they're
trying to,
actually claiming it as false
right,
propaganda. And now even more, I see like every day there's new media reports and news coverage about how the West is making up all these lies and none of it is true. They're completely
right.
denying it. So how do
Well,
we?
look, just put it in context in support of the Uyghurs. I mean, this is the same government that would deny that Mao killed tens of millions, same government that would deny that they gunned down innocent students at Tiananmen Square in 1989, same government that would deny that it's engaged in the violation of the transfer agreement on Hong Kong between the UK and China that Margaret Thatcher negotiated, same government that's violated, a whole bunch of national security, nuclear, chemical, and other weapons development programs, a regime that's been engaged in the most horrific human rights violations of modern times, selling of organs, extermination of people by ethnic and religious identity. I am the belief, and I think this is more, broadly understood today than it has been, that the regime in North Korea is more or less a pawn and a client state of China. Again, what do they have in common? One of the most repressive regimes in the world. Now, of course, they're entering into a relationship, economic, geopolitical, and strategic and defense oriented with the Islamic regime in Iran, which is the ultimate sad irony that you would have this Islamic regime that
Horrible.
professes and has professed since 1979 that they are guided by adherence to principles of the Muslim religion and are now willingly, anxiously pursuing what is probably going to be one of China's closest relationships in the world, because it's
Sadly.
not China. China, Xi Jinping likes to speak in global terms, as you know. We're engaged in a very complex struggle with them in the sense that they have a very, very developed strategic plan that they're executing on.
Yes.
We are dealing with a government that doesn't think in long-term ways at all. And even to this day, this administration, the Biden administration, perfect example, underestimates the magnitude of impact, or if it doesn't underestimate it, subscribes to this thesis of a managed decline of China's inevitable ascent, which is one that um, has got to be understood by the American people and rejected. And it can be stopped. There's no doubt about it, but it's going to require the willing commitment of of our administration, of our Congress, and of the people themselves. I mean,
Yes.
when I look at the progress that's been made on the Uyghur issue, it's been very grassroots driven. And the more American people are exposed just to even some of the more fundamental realities of what's actually transpiring there, the more
I
horrified they
agree.
are. I mean, this is a this is precisely the never again scenario that we promised would never again happen
Yes.
after the Holocaust. And well, it's always kind of a mistake to compare anything to Hitler, anything to the Holocaust, anything to Nazi Germany. You know, there's a solid seven-figure number of Uyghurs that are being held in detention, re-education facilities that are incredibly reminiscent of that precise moment. And I can't help but make the comparison that I don't think many people have made, but I think back about the outrage that existed globally about Guantanamo Bay, where we held roughly 200, almost certainly designated Al Qaeda operatives and suspects. Um, and the world was outraged over that. These were people with legitimate ties to terrorism, and they were defendants in those cases. They were kept offshore because holding them domestically would have required the United States under its laws to afford them all sorts of due process that we didn't want to do as a product of them as both defendants and prisoners of war. But the distinction here is twofold. I mean, number one, we're talking about a mammoth amount of people, you know,
You could say
a
there's
40, 50% perhaps of the entire Uyghur population of that region. And then we're talking about people who are almost uniformly innocent of any wrongdoing. They're being held.
I've heard from 2 million to 5 million people and counting.
Right. Well, it's very difficult to get those numbers completely down when you have a government in Xi Jinping that is
Exactly.
denying access to these camps. And by the way, that's inexcusable. It's also inexcusable that we weren't afforded access to the P4 lab that almost certainly was the origin of this global pandemic in Wuhan. So you can see this recurring theme. They lied to the World Health Organization about the conditions, and they have lied to the world and to the UN about the human rights conditions in East Turkestan regarding the treatment of these Uyghurs. And if the situation is as they've advertised, which it's not, but if it were hypothetically, you wouldn't be facing the objections to the inspections that they're
Exactly.
required to offer. There's a reason they don't want foreigners looking at this Wuhan Institute of Virology. There's a reason they don't want to see inspections of these detention facilities in of the Uyghurs, and that is that they are both legitimate um, and probably the most significant uh, human rights and threats really that have existed to the world. And that's the ultimate hypocrisy that I think is most bothersome to me, is that this is a regime that is representing to the rest of the world that they are positioned to kind of be leaders
Superpower.
on on main themes. Yeah, that this is, you know, a logical evolution of their role. And while it's clearly a large country, 1.4 billion people, and while it's clearly, you know, we've allowed its economy to grow to the second largest in the world. That's been, as former President Trump pointed out, the largest transfer of wealth in the history of man between the United States and China, because we were under this delusion, really, that their economic growth was a constructive thing. They've turned around and used all those resources to militarize, to expand their illegal occupation and capacity, in the South China Sea, and to suppress what I think increasingly is, like, I don't want to overplay the comparisons to the Soviet Union because there's a lot of distinctions and differences, but this really is, and should be emphasized in this way, is a wholly unnatural country.
Yes.
If you afforded any one of these provincial populations the opportunity, you went to South Mongolia, you go to Hong Kong, go to Tibet, go to Xinjiang, any of these places, and you say, do you want to be a part, do you want to continue to be part of China, or would you prefer independent support for that independence? And of course, that's precisely what concerns Xi Jinping and this regime in Beijing, is that they're holding this whole thing together. Nobody, certainly no one elected him president for life. And his only accountability is to this very small, highly ideological, militant, human rights abusing, cult-like criminal organization that is the China's Communist Party. And this is
I
a
agree.
global, I think the way to word it is this a global criminal syndicate. I mean, you see that in 100 different examples, even in our own country with the with their exportation, of broad range of opioids that they've manufactured over there and brought into our country. They're doing extraordinary harm, not just to their own people, but to the people of the world. And
Yes.
we need to now awaken to a new reality, because we've been told by a lot of really smart people that these guys would be, reasonable partners, and that they represented a large market for U.S. exports and job creation. It's been the exact opposite. They've hollowed out the American middle class in this country. They've cheated on just about every trade practice and agreement they've entered into. They've stolen intellectual property to the tune of an extraordinary sum of money. And now they're bragging about it because they got an administration in the Biden administration that apparently is not terribly concerned about that. But
They're
you
not.
see,
They said
yeah,
that
you
they
see
put
how,
sanctions on the exports that are coming in from China made from Xinjiang forced labor. But when you look at the stats, it's actually increased. The imports, the amount of imports have increased ever since they, put this ban out there. It clearly is not a ban. So who's keeping track of this, and how do we fix this issue?
well, firstly, we do have our trade statistics, and you can monitor them almost on a monthly basis as far as what our trade deficits are, what our imports and exports are. And if you go all the way back to about 1980, we had a net, no surplus, no deficit in our trade relationship with China. And you just follow it incrementally. And this has been a bipartisan problem in our country, is that we've allowed these extraordinarily unbalanced terms to just exist. In fact, in the case of automobiles, where we confront, I think, a 20 or 25% tariff on our exports of autos into China, we in turn impose a 2% tariff. Okay, so it's a fraction of that. But unknown to most Americans, we didn't even bother collecting it for many years. So there's been essentially no tariffs
Oh,
against
wow.
China.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. And this has just been part of this overall policy. And, let me give you another example. I mean, we now know, and those of us, as you likely know, as someone following this closely, that our NIH has put millions of dollars into this Wuhan virology lab, the only P4 facility in all of Asia. This is immensely dangerous testing, viral testing, that in fact even the Obama administration had put an end to in roughly, I think, 2014. when it was uncovered. And, Fauci, who's being presented as some sort of solution to this crisis, which is I would say it's laughable, but the whole situation is so traffic, you can't really laugh at any component of it, is really, to the extent you're going to pinpoint who's responsible, it was Fauci who funded this lab, and he funded it because, he felt that they wouldn't confront the restrictions on the testing in Wuhan that they would in the United States. And incredibly, as it relates to the obvious bias of the American media, this guy has probably done 500 or 1,000 interviews by now. I don't think he's been once presented with the question, by the way, what were you doing sending US taxpayer money to this high level gain of function, which is to say, that's the sort of biological term for militant development of these viruses. You keep upping their potency and you keep upping the transmittability. All right. So these are already deadly viruses, this COVID. You keep, manipulating it in ways that it becomes more and more toxic, more and more effective. Now, why would for a possible vaccine in case it, evolves into a more dangerous state? But the real truth is you do it for the purposes of biological warfare. And
Yes.
that's what's been going on in this facility. And which, by the way, itself is a violation of a whole bunch of accords and agreements that China signed. I think it's an intriguing question, though, to ask. And I want this question asked.
Even Bill Gates hasn't been questioned.
Yeah, but let's start with Tony Fauci, who's been there since 1970s, right? And was, the singular guy who initiated this funding of this lab. And on what possible basis are US interests served? And now we've got the former administration officials who, kind of look at what the intel that we've been able to develop, and they're pretty clear cut on the obvious fact that that was the source of this pandemic. This idea that it somehow originated in a wet market was already discounted, has already been definitively discounted. And the idea that it originated in the transport of sort of animal to human transmission with things from down in the Laos Vietnamese border, which, as you may know, is like 800 miles away from Wuhan. It's probably about a 20-hour drive through, insulting to the intelligence, really, of anyone who's listening to these guys.
I agree. I feel like the American people, and actually people globally, just don't want to think about all of these intricate details, and that will make them raise like questions and curiosity as to, what's going on here. It's all a big mess and no one wants to get to the bottom of it. They're kind of just following blindly whatever they're told by doctors.
Some do. Some people do. Some people do want to get to the bottom of it.
Thankfully.
And I will acknowledge that you're right, that it's a small number. I put myself in that category, and there's some great competent people from the administration that are committed to it. And we've already unveiled a lot of things. But I have to say, obviously it's frustrating. I mean, it's frustrating that we don't have fire alarms going off as it relates to this situation, because literally at this very moment, you're dealing with men, women, and children who are being detained, tortured, exclusively because of their ethnic affiliation. And this is the same regime that had the audacity to come over here and lecture us up in Anchorage about conditions in the United States. That should have frankly been the end of that meeting right there. in my judgment.
Yeah, well, it was expected from them with everything that they do to kind of cover up what they're doing and just, be dismissive about themselves. It's expected for them to behave this way, but what do we do? So as in like what you're doing right now, what are your next steps into, combating this issue, this genocide?
Well, I'm pleased with the fact that the Uyghurs have really begun to organize in the West, and there's some
Yes.
really dedicated organizations and outlets, and the work you guys are doing is very laudable. That's part of it. We've got Congress is the good thing about we're still in a functioning democracy here. So as much as the administration may be not taking it as seriously as we would want, there are members of Congress who are taking it immensely seriously. And you could see in the administration, they didn't completely cave on this issue. I mean, they're acknowledging that it's going on. That's important because that's not always the case in these genocidal situations. We've got to insist on the inspections. And I also think there's a lot of just general education of the West and the American people generally. I mean, the irony is that we faced all this activism from the left on issues as it relates to discrimination. The singular greatest violator of and discriminator on the basis of ethnicity in the world today is the Communist Party of China. They're very active on the issue of the environment, far and away the largest CO2 emitter in the world. Building coal plants in 2 weeks and developing their energy resources while they call on us to contain and reduce our own industrial capacities is the Communist Party of China. I mean, you could take just about every one of these major issues, and they've been able to fund, support, and manipulate public dialogue very successfully. And a big part of that is the fact that as part of this neglect of their aggressiveness, we've allowed amount of influential institutions in this country. So we need to shut down, these Confucius institutes on university campuses. We need to, I think, really cease and reflect on the role that China-based money is having in the universities and
Yes.
in media. I mean, we just kudos to the National Pulse, a great new media outlet. It just came out with a whole bunch of mainstream American media figures who are over in China on the CCP dime on one of their propaganda tours. No, they never revealed any of this.
There's no
And
coverage on it.
we've seen, I think, kind of in a lot of the coverage, this unwillingness to tackle the issue. But not exclusively. I will say, some of the Wall Street Journal reporting, some of the New York Times reporting, they've done some good jobs. And as you know,
Yes, I
they
agree.
kicked out. Yeah, they kicked out a number of Western journalists after we required their media outlets to register as foreign agents here, which of course they are. I mean, and I've appeared on some of those networks. I do so with a complete understanding of what it is, but just representing, my view and our view to the extent possible. But when you're dealing with a state-operated, state-controlled media outlet, I mean, it's not an independent entity. It's functioning as part of an operation to influence the West. So that's okay. I think we should allow them here. Hear what they have to say, um, and I don't, I'm not one of these believers that we just completely, cease ties. It's almost unrealistic at this point.
You can't
But
do
to your
that.
question, what do? This pandemic to reveal that we have like 90% of generics in our pharmaceuticals coming from China, unacceptable. We need to look at the most vital sort of product and service lines and get away from any degree of reliance on China and explore alternatives. Unfortunately, I think we've kind of made the error of allowing short-sighted savings in business operations to compromise the big picture agenda of American security, American interests, and human rights. And the only good news is we're in a moment where I think the American people are more tuned into this human rights issue than maybe in any time in history. And if you're going to start anywhere, this is the worst human rights situation in our lifetimes, period.
Yes,
I
I
mean,
agree.
really, I mean, and we've had some really bad ones, obviously. I mean, you go back and look at the Central African issue and look at the Pol Pot in Cambodia, but on a strict magnitude of the mammoth number of people that are being affected by this, the people who are missing, people who have been executed, and the nature and the extreme graphic disregard for any consideration of these individuals as human beings, I think it ranks as the biggest concern we've confronted ever. And it needs to be matched with that level
Absolutely
of
right.
seriousness.
Yes, yes. Everyone needs to understand the seriousness of this issue and the fact that it could have a very big impact on the entire world if we let them get away with this.
Well, what they would do in East Turkestan is certainly potentially replicated just about anywhere, and it has been replicated. I mean, we look at the I mentioned the pandemic, but look at the whistleblowers who just disappeared. We don't know their whereabouts. I don't feel we're putting enough focus on demanding that. And quite honestly, that could have been the first question that we asked before even meeting in Anchorage, is to say, where are these individuals? And here's the list.
Yes.
Uh, and where are these dissidents in Hong Kong who've disappeared, whose families have not been notified of their whereabouts, simply because they spoke out in defense of what was a treaty agreement between China and the UK over that was to guarantee 50 years of self-governance and two systems, one country, which was just arbitrarily violated. And all those sort of point to a conclusion of the magnitude of what we're confronting. And we're now dealing with a government that's got a very sophisticated global development program that is also threatening, I think, to our commercial and economic and thus security interests. Vast increases in space defense spending and in their weapons program, and what a lot of people, me included, believe could be an imminent threat to the independence of Taiwan.
Yes.
And by imminent, I mean, there's concern about the next few months as it relates to Taiwan's defense. And I think we need to, and Taiwan needs to confront this reality collectively with us. If you recall, the history's worth recalling, because when Nixon went over to meet with Mao, we had about half a dozen issues that we wanted China's cooperation with. And we had the Vietnam War, we had the Soviet Union, we had a lot of broad issues. They had one issue that was on their mind, and that is they wanted the recognition and the derecognition of the Republic of China. And that's relevant because at no time had the Uyghurs ever chosen or been naturally governed by this communist regime. I mean, they were a part of the Republic of China before 1949, and they have a long-standing, multi-thousand-year history of independent political, cultural, and ethnic identity that can't just be sort of ignored and
No,
swept into this regime. And of course, I think, you know, in essence, that Xi Jinping understands all of that, and that's why they're engaged in these forced marriages and this sort of
or sterilizations.
right. And you know, and it's all baseless because, you know, their response is to sort of say, well, no, this is part of a global war on terror, and these individuals all represent
They're all extreme.
threats. But I will tell you, having worked with leadership and communicated with them in the West, these are peaceful, uh, at least on a leadership basis, peaceful individuals who
Yes,
reject that ideology completely. And there's no evidence of it. And while there've been some incidents, there's incidents all over China every day. There's no systematic, well, there would never be any systematic justification for doing what they're doing.
no,
But my point
no
is
way to
their
know.
rebuttal to this is completely off base. We need to so we need a plan on this. I don't, and it's urgent, all right? This is not something we just sort of get around to when we feel it's convenient. If human rights
I
matter at
agree.
all, and I believe they do matter immensely, and I said that as an American first foreign policy person too, right? Meaning I do see a problem in the world. We've sometimes tried to solve problems that made them worse. I think you could kind of put the Iraq invasion in that category. Um, but here we can be and really have to be practices. And we cannot have a normal relationship with Beijing until they have committed to ending them and until we have verified independently that they have in fact ended.
Yes, I completely agree. And it's been a pleasure speaking with you. So informative. I'm so glad that we were able to make this happen. I'm sorry that I have to cut this short now. And as I have other,
Good to be with you. I appreciate you having me.
yes, thank you so much. Maybe
Keep
we
up the
can
good
do this
work.
again.
Look
We can
forward to it.
continue because the information and all of the enlightenment you've provided us with has been great. And I thank you on behalf of Voice of Uyghur.
Thank you, and thanks to all of your audience and for gluing in, and you know, make sure you tell your friends and family and educate others, because the
Yes,
word's got to get out about this. This is how we're going to force political change and a change in our policy.
I
Uh,
agree with you
it's not just the United
completely.
States either. I mean, the EU, all, you know, any government in the world that represents, that it stands for decency and human rights, has to stand up
Yes,
right now on this issue.
I agree. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you,
all
Aisha.
that you do. Thank you for your time. Have a great day.
You as well.